Evio. Welcome back to The Devil Within and our continuing re-release of Season 1 in support of the MGM docuseries Let the Devil In. We've arrived at the final episode, A Prayer in Spring. Yes, there is one more official episode in the series, but it's an interview episode where I go over, basically everything I've already explored on these Redux episodes. So the episodes this week will close the book on Season 1, and let's get into it. A Prayer in Spring Redux, Part 1. Another Robert Frost poem, and you know what that means. That's right, time for Poetry Corner with Branden. And again, thank you for indulging me. So when people talk about Robert Frost, the poet laureate of the American pasture, the same handful of titles always comes up, and I'm guilty of it also. Stopping by Woods, The Road Not Taken, Nothing Gold Can Stay. They're the poems that we all read in school. They get recited at commencement ceremonies. They're quotes on coffee mugs and little throw pillows. They've become cultural shorthand. Little pieces of New England turned into universal truths. But tucked away in the quieter corners of Frost's early work, before he became Robert Frost, the voice of rural America, there's a poem that he wrote called A Prayer in Spring. It's short, it's simple, like Frost, almost a little too simple, but also like Frost, that simplicity hides something subtle, and I think something brave. So the poem goes like this. Oh, give us pleasure in the flowers today, and give us not to think so far away as the uncertain harvest. Keep us here, all simply in the springing of the year. Oh, give us pleasure in the orchard white, like nothing else by day, like ghosts by night. And make us happy in the happy bees, the swarm dilating around the perfect trees. And make us happy in the darting bird that suddenly above the bees is heard. That meteor that thrusts in with needle bill, and off a blossom in midair stands still. For this is love, and nothing else is love. That which is reserved for God above to sanctify to what far ends he will, but which it only needs that we fulfill. That's it. 4 stanzas. A prayer, literally, but not a church prayer. It's a human prayer. A Prayer in Spring was first published in 1915 in Frost's second book called A Boy's Will. He just moved back to the U.S. after a few years living in England, years that kind of helped transform him from a failed, or I guess struggling farmer into a published poet. He was already in his early 40s and only finally gaining any traction in the poetry world, but he wasn't anywhere near the elder statesman yet of American verse. The book's title, A Boy's Will, that says it all. It's about youth. It's about yearning and that stubborn, innocent desire to make sense of a world that refuses to remain stable. And this particular poem, A Prayer in Spring, is one of his earliest and gentlest expressions of that will. It's Frost looking at the world not as a philosopher, but as a man just trying to be present. And that's a theme that would haunt his work for decades. So most of Frost's best-known poems are haunted by this feeling of distance, either literal or emotional. Stopping by Woods can be interpreted as exploring the temptation to step away from obligation, to disappear into the anonymity and the quiet of the woods. The Road Not Taken is about the future, about regret and revision, and how our choices define us. Nothing Gold Can Stay mourns impermanence itself. But A Prayer in Spring is different. It's not about loss. It's about choosing not to think about loss. It's Frost in this rare state of surrender. He's asking for permission to enjoy something that he knows is fleeting while it's still here. Just look at the opening line. Oh, give us pleasure in the flowers today. It's almost embarrassingly direct. It sounds like something a child would say, or a minister, someone trying not to cry. But the brilliance of Frost is that he never meant for simplicity to be misconstrued as naive. He uses plain language to talk about things that language can't really solve. Time, faith, beauty, the fear that joy sometimes always has an expiration date. All right, on paper the poem is really straightforward. It's a prayer of gratitude. It's an appeal to stay rooted in the moment. But if you listen closely, there is this quiet anxiety that's humming or bubbling underneath. Give us not to think so far away as the uncertain harvest. It's not just about farming and worried, can I get the crop brought in? That's about mortality. Harvest for Frost is always a metaphor for death, for judgment, for the end of things. He's asking God to keep him from living too much in the future, from losing the sweetness of now by fearing the cost of later. And that's always the part that strikes me. It's not joy that Frost is struggling with here. It's permission. Permission to enjoy something beautiful without waiting for it to end. And the poem's imagery is pure Frost. There's, bees and orchards, birds, the push and pull of light and shadow. But just listen to how he uses them. The orchard white, like nothing else by day, like ghosts by night. That line, like ghosts by night, gives the poem its soul. Even in beauty, Frost can't help but see that we're haunted. The orchard is alive and blooming, but at night it looks like the dead coming back. The beauty also contains the mortality. It's not a contradiction. He presents it as a coexistence. And then the hummingbird, as a meteor that thrusts with needle bill. That's Frost finding wonder in a small violence. This tiny bird stabbing blossoms like a celestial weapon. It's motion and grace and destruction all at once. The poem never lets you forget that joy and danger are siblings. And then he closes with, "For this is love, and nothing else is love." It's one of the most quietly profound moments in his work, really. He's not talking about romantic love. He's describing a love that comes from attention, from noticing what's in front of you and naming it as holy. That which is reserved for God above to sanctify what far ends he will. That's Frost's theology in a nutshell. We don't control the meaning. We only get to fulfill it by living, seeing, by feeling. That's our half of the contract. He's saying, let God handle the eternal, we'll handle the orchard. Now, in the Frost canon, A Prayer in Spring isn't, top tier famous. It's not as anthologized as much as like Mending Wall or Fire and Ice. And okay, if Stopping by Woods is the show-stopping number and then The Road Not Taken is the encore, A Prayer in Spring is something in the first set that you might miss if you show up late. Critically, it's considered an early Frost poem, part of his more optimistic phase. But, in the last, 10, 15 years, it pops up in some modern scholarly kind of reevaluations. They see it not as simple piety, but as kind of a subtle precursor to the darker meditations on time and loss that come up later in his career. And you could almost feel the storm clouds of Nothing Gold Can Stay gathering behind the sentiment in this. I mean, where Nothing Gold Can Stay compresses transience into those 8 just devastating lines, A Prayer in Spring does the opposite. It breathes, it pauses, it asks for grace. If Nothing Gold Can Stay is acceptance through resignation, then A Prayer in Spring is acceptance through gratitude. Let's compare them side by side for a second. Stopping by Woods is about the desire to rest, to surrender to stillness. The Road Not Taken is about the desire to choose, to create meaning from those choices. Nothing Gold Can Stay is about the inability to hold on. And A Prayer in Spring is about the choice to stay present despite that knowledge. It's the antidote to the melancholy in those other poems. It doesn't solve the problem of impermanence. It just accepts it as one of the conditions of beauty. And that's why, though it's not as famous, many Frost readers, a lot of poets, they love it deeply because it feels honest. Not grand, not tragic, not overly clever, just human. So Frost once wrote that a poem begins in delight and ends in wisdom. This one begins in delight and ends kind of in surrender. I mean, that might be the same thing, depending on how old you are. But it's a reminder that wonder isn't something we ever outgrow. It's something that we have to keep choosing. That we don't pray for miracles. We pray for awareness. That the opening line, that pleasure in the flowers today, might be the closest to heaven that most of us ever really get. In a world obsessed with outcomes, with harvest, right? With success, with legacy. The idea behind this poem is radical. Keep us here all simply in the springing of the year? Maybe because what he's saying is heaven isn't the reward. Maybe the reward is the orchard. And maybe the prayer is learning how to stay present long enough to be able to notice that. So that's A Prayer in Spring by Robert Frost, a small poem with a huge heart. It may be a good one to carry with you, especially this time of year when everything beautiful just seems so temporary. And I don't think I have to really get into how closely this relates to what happened to Tommy Sullivan and everybody involved in that story back in the winter of '88. Because it seems like every single sentiment that was expressed in this poem, all the simple beauty of focusing on the now and realizing that there's nothing to get, that everything is here, that all of the beauty and the joy and the wonder is in front of you every day, that all of that was completely ignored or dismissed by everyone involved in the Tommy Sullivan case back then. So, anyway, that's my take on it. This has been Poetry Corner with Branden. On with the show. From the Upper West Side of Manhattan, over the George Washington Bridge and into northern New Jersey, it's a pretty straight shot along Route 80, about 35 miles, to get to the exit for Jefferson Township. You need to get off on Route 15 for a few miles to get to the exit for Berkshire Valley Road, and then all of a sudden, you're swallowed by the forest. It's springtime in the Northeast, and despite the constant shadow of a global pandemic and a political season that exposed enormous fault lines in the fabric of our society, it's impossible to ignore the simple and stunning beauty of this landscape. Spring seems to have bloomed overnight, and the forest indeed seems endless, dominated by the rich, verdant green of the trees and the soft blue of the April sky. Today I'm approaching Jefferson from the south, intentionally. If I had taken the northern approach, getting off Route 80 earlier onto Route 287 and taking that to the Hamburg Turnpike, well, that would take me right past Clinton Road, and I don't want to do that, not yet. For now, I want to enjoy the scenic beauty of this valley and try to understand what happened here more than 3 decades ago. Not unlike Clinton Road, Berkshire Valley Road is a long, desolate strip of asphalt and concrete that cuts through a forest, parallels a stream, and connects an isolated pocket of civilization with the larger outside world. This drive serves as a not-so-gentle reminder of the isolated nature of this community. And to be honest, sometimes it's a little unsettling. A few miles before the center of town, I turn left onto Dover Milton Road and find myself driving through a neighborhood of tidy homes with nice lawns, and off to the right through the trees, I catch occasional glimpses of Lake Swannanoa, a Ringling Brothers creation from more than 100 years ago. Dover Milton Road ends at Milton Road, and there, on the left, perched atop a small rise on the banks of a rushing creek, sits the ancient and solemn Riker Public Library, now the town museum. A left onto Milton Road, and 100 yards later, a right, takes me onto Schoolhouse Road, where I grew up. It's a nice 2-mile stretch of single-family homes with yards and swimming pools and woods. I passed the imposing and stoic one-room schoolhouse from which the road gets its name, built before the turn of the century, now used as a storage facility for Milton Elementary School that takes up the bigger parcel of land that it sits on. I come to a traffic signal, not a stoplight, just a blinking light at the corner of Schoolhouse and Ridge Road, and I turn right. Less than a quarter mile, I slow down to turn into the neighborhood called White Rock. And it isn't long before I come to a stop in front of a gray, one-story home with a sloping front lawn and a Toyota in the driveway. This is where it happened. This is the quiet, peaceful home that was visited by unspeakable evil on a snowy night in January of 1988. And unfortunately, that wasn't the end of the story for this town, for this street, or even for this house. Let's briefly talk about the geography of North Jersey and why it's so heavily forested, despite the fact that the entire state of New Jersey holds the distinction of being part of the greater New York City metropolitan area. More than 35,000 acres, and remember, New Jersey isn't that big of a place. 35,000 acres were set aside in the 3 northernmost counties, Sussex County, Morris County, Passaic County. They were set aside to ensure that the city of Newark, which is about 50 miles to the southeast, would have enough clean drinking water for their citizens. The project was called the Newark Watershed. Now, it's not the full title. There was something with, like, the word conservation was in there, or whatever. Everyone just calls it the Newark Watershed. And it refers to a vast system of reservoirs, rivers, and other protected lands that provide all that water. Over 80 million gallons per day. Hardly any of those 35,000 acres as of 1970 were allowed to be developed, because the natural forest itself provides the best mechanism to prevent pollution. The land acts as a natural filtration system. The dense root systems of the pine and birch forests minimizes the runoff and the sedimentation, and contamination from any of the small towns and villages that were allowed to be built are manageable because of that isolation. So when people think of New Jersey and the only images conjured are Newark or, Atlantic City or Hoboken, and they're all fine cities, don't get me wrong, just get up north and you'll see why it's called the Garden State. Ever since I listened to the interview with Mayor Eric Wilsusen, I haven't been able to shake one particular exchange, one part of the story, and it's this. The mayor said point blank that representatives of the Catholic Church were convinced that the Tommy Sullivan murder-suicide was a case of demonic possession. That local law enforcement was instructed to maintain a strict armed perimeter during Tommy's funeral for fear that an effort would be made by Satanists to reclaim Tommy's body, by force if necessary, and that he had personally inspected Tommy's sketchbook and saw the terrifying shift from boyish scribblings to frightening depictions of demons. Now, I'm fully aware that evil exists in the world. I'm also aware that evil can take many forms, and I'm willing to admit, I believe that there is much about the nature of evil that lies beyond the scope of human understanding. Do I believe that demonic possession in the purely Catholic sense is possible? The best answer I can give is that the truth must lie beyond my understanding, because there are some things that I simply cannot answer. But here's what I do know. I know that 10 years after that terrible night in January of 1988, Tommy's little brother took his own life. It's impossible to know why, or if there was any connection to the awful events from his childhood. But it seems that evil and darkness and tragedy wouldn't allow the family any lasting peace. I know that Betty Ann Sullivan, Tommy's mother and victim of his rage, has a sister who, in the aftermath of the murder, petitioned the court to examine the police files in an attempt to better understand what happened to her beloved sister, and to perhaps get a glimpse into the clouded, broken mind of her young nephew, to better understand what happened to him, and hopefully get some answers. She was granted access, unfortunately, and what she saw in the file, the photos, the forensic accounts of the crime scenes, statements from the civilians and first responders, basically everything she was looking for, had an effect that must have been shocking, for soon after, she chose to turn her back on society at large and became a cloistered nun at a convent somewhere in the Northeast. What did she see? What did she learn? Whatever it was, she felt that her best option was to immerse herself in a personal relationship with Christ and little else. I also know that within 6 months of losing his wife and oldest son, Tommy Sullivan Sr. was remarried in Florida. Now, many locals saw that as an indictment of the man, but one lesson the years have taught me is that people indeed grieve in many different ways. As a husband and father, I can only imagine that any distraction that would grant a reprieve from what must have been unimaginable anguish would be welcomed. I would bet that for a man going through that hell, public opinion from a small town in New Jersey was the last thing on his mind. And finally, I know that towards the end of the series, we veered away from an attempt to stick to established facts and first-hand accounts, as factual as 30-year-old recollections can be, and opted instead to offer a definitive ending to the story, fantastic though it may seem. The convergence of myth and reality has long been pondered and explored, yet rarely, if ever, has it landed on solid footing. That doesn't mean it isn't true. It just means it hasn't been proven. Yet. It's often said that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And I would submit that, in a way, the Tommy Sullivan case meets that burden. Not for what evidence exists, but for what evidence doesn't exist. I find it extraordinary that a young boy could inflict such damage to himself, defying the limits of human endurance and physicality, circumstances that no medical examiner, coroner, or EMT could explain, not to this day. That question remains more than 30 years later. My feeling is that there is one person who knows the answer, and it is hopelessly debated, in prayerful whispers, safe behind the austere stone walls of a convent, from a grieving nun, desperate to understand how it all fits into God's plan. Yeah. There's just so many fucked up aspects of this story that kept rolling out over the decades. During pre-production of the TV show, investigators who already knew the fate of Brian Sullivan, that he had committed suicide 12 or maybe 13 years after the tragedy involving his mother and his older brother. I guess that would put him at about 20 when he died. Investigators were able to find some obituary reports. They got a few details, like where he was living, where he was working, where he was buried. I'll spare you the details. I mean, nothing extraordinary or spooky, just sad, really. He was buried next to his mom in the family plot outside Philly, where Tommy's body was eventually moved to, quietly exhumed and moved to. He was originally buried in the cemetery behind St. Thomas's in Jefferson. The other crazy story is about Betty Ann's sister. So this story was originally told to me by a family friend who demanded anonymity. But I'll tell you now. No, I'm kidding. I'll obviously respect that covenant, but it was mostly corroborated by law enforcement as we move forward with the show. So the sister was one of the few civilians allowed to see the full police report, including crime scene photos, and the effect on her was instant and severe. She completely left behind her entire life and became a cloistered nun for the next 20 years. When our investigators found her, she was still living in the convent, but had, I guess, uncloistered herself, and she made a return to academia. She'd been a teacher before taking her final vows, but unfortunately she had zero interest in participating in the show. It just seems like this poor family just can't seem to escape tragedy, like it was written in blood in some fucked up cosmic contract that was initiated that night. Not that contract that Tommy drew up, but something more powerful, more all-inclusive. Something that seems to mark the family because, let me tell you, the more we found out about Tom Sr., the more likely that fucked up contract theory seems to be true. Yeah, I kind of buried the lead a little bit. Tom Sr. is still alive. And what we found out about him was fucking crazy. But we'll save that for next time on part 2 of A Prayer in Spring Redux. So make sure you're following The Devil Within wherever you get your podcasts, and check out the other shows on the Evio Creative Network. Plus, if you're more of a video person, all of our shows are available on YouTube on the Evio Creative YouTube channel. I'd appreciate a follow there, as we're really trying to build up that audience and the listenership. So rate, review, and share wherever you're listening, and we'll see you next time for part 2. Happy Halloween, and until then, stay safe out there. The Devil Within is an Evio production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. For The Devil Within, I'm your host, Branden Morgan.